Okay, welcome back to Psychology as a Natural Science. Today I'm joined by Ruth Reymundo Mandel and David Mandel from the Safe and Together Institute to talk about intimate partner violence, coercive control, and what anyone supporting a survivor needs to understand. So, welcome to the show, you guys.
Thank you.
I want to start by just acknowledging that I am recording from Dja Dja Wurrung country in what's known as Central Victoria now, and to just pay my respects to Aboriginal people here, to the Jarrah elders, and to recognize that I'm sitting on stolen land within a colony on a place where sovereignty was never ceded. And I want to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander viewers or First Nations viewers from anywhere around the world. And David and Ruth are going to do a land acknowledgement in a minute. I just want to introduce you folks and then I'm going to unpin myself and we'll see if our technology works. So I wanted to start by just thanking you both for your work in developing and sharing this model. Is one of the hopes of this channel is to uplift models in counseling, psychology, and social work that involve building systems of practice based on observation of the realities of clients and also with an awareness of the cultural folklore that obscures or impedes that progress. And I think that the underlying assumptions of systems should be based on observation of events and they should be explicitly stated. And I really appreciate the way Safe and Together does both. So gonna unpin myself and see what happens. And thank you both for joining me.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And I want to just join you in that we're coming from indigenous land, Masako Tunxis land, the East Coast of the United States, Connecticut area, which is between Boston and New York, for those of you who might not know East Coast geography, and again, acknowledge the traditional owners of land here, beautiful Farmington River Valley
Mhm.
with a river running through, and it's a luscious time of year, green, beautiful, wet, very verdant. And just acknowledge indigenous elders here that we're also on colonized land, and really pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging as well. So we share, unfortunately, that history of colonization between Australia and the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So David, I've been working through your book, Stop Blaming Mothers and Stop Ignoring Fathers. And Ruth, I've loved hearing your insights on partnering with the Survivor podcast. And I was at the conference you put on in Melbourne. It's probably 2 years ago now. Time goes so
Mhm.
fast. I really appreciated hearing like both your insights in that space. I'm wondering if to start with, you could just talk about the Safe and Together model, why it was needed, like how it evolved, like some of the history of it, and why you think it's important to the work with survivors.
Well, I'll start. I think it fits really well, Ollie, with what this podcast is about. For years, I was a practitioner, did direct work with families. And while a lot of that work was directly with users of violence, the actual client, if I could say it that way, were survivors, adult survivors, child survivors. And so doing good work in that space with the users of violence, users of control, um, had to be and still has to be measured by, does it really change the lived experience of the survivors? That is the core measurement. So it's not, did somebody pass a test, or what's their psychological profile, or what's their diagnoses. It's not even, just looking at their internal world. They could feel better about themselves and still be abusive. So from the beginning, the inception of, and I think it's still the definition of good work, when you talk about doing behavior change or whatever with users of violence, the core measure of success has to be the real lived, tangible change in the experience of the victim survivors, adult and child. So that, if you want to ask the genesis of the model, it's in that work. that then kind of built into this entire system around how do you help systems. So instead of doing the individual work with the men or the group work with the men, how do you get systems to better intervene with them, particularly as parents, with the same measure of success? How do you get systems then to partner with survivors? Because we found that those two things were connected. That a lot of these systems that were kid focused were just focusing on moms, and they were ignoring the fathers, hence the title of the book. And so you couldn't sort of shift the equation in one direction. You had to stop blaming mothers. You actually had to get systems to actually focus more on users of violence as parents, and that all that impacts the kids, right? All that affects the kids and the whole community and kin and network. So from the beginning, the model has really been very grounded in direct lived experience and behaviors, which again I think is really right in the wheelhouse of your message.
I just want to add that, one of the things that really attracted to me to the model and working with David, who's my partner in life and also my business partner, is that it really did center around what is good parenting. And though there's a lot of conversation around what is good parenting in regard to mothers and maternal bonding, there's a woeful lack of conversation around what is good parenting as fathers. What is good parenting to boys? How do men feel about being fathers? How do they operationalize that in ways that are really positive for their children, that give them nurturance, that give them safety, that give them emotional and physical stability and economic stability? And I really feel sad that so many people assume that men and boys don't actually want to engage in those types of behaviors, that there isn't a fundamental desire, drive to be connected like that as humans and as fathers. And actually, behaviorally, if we were to look at probably a lot of male parental behaviors and talk to men about their experience, that they would say that they are deeply nourished and find meaning in being fathers. Maybe some don't. That's okay. They don't have to. But we really aren't having that conversation about how fatherhood and men as parents behaviors um, can be channeled into child well-being, child protection, child development that's healthy and in alignment with the child's needs. And that lack of conversation is really a lack of focus on men and their emotional, psychological, and social well-being and development. And that is just absolutely a sad commentary about society and how we focused. So, being a person who grew up in an institution and didn't have connection with my paternal family, I really get the value of engaged, safe, nurturing, present fathers. And I think everybody can get on board with that, you know, and we need to.
Yeah, so I love how you've laid that out that yeah, there's these two sides of the coin that if you hold mothers accountable for everything, even what's completely out of their control, then by definition, you also make fathers invisible and just completely eliminate them from the conversation. And I love that we can do that in a way that's not about like some kind of men's rights advocacy kind of thing, but is about genuine conversations about accountable, safe, loving parenting and expecting that of men as well. I love that.
It's about being human, really, if you think of it at the end of the day. I mean, we can categorize all those supportive behaviors and actions, and we can model them for each other. But men are human beings. They're complete and full human beings with complete and full emotional lives, emotional intelligence, and the capacity to do anything that they need to do to contribute to their children. So I think we should all start moving from there. It's a good assumption, right? And if not, we need to give people the skills.
Mm, mm, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've already touched on it, but I wonder if you could just lay out like what the underlying beliefs and assumptions of the model are, and maybe how those differ from some cultural norms that you've come across.
It's all tied together, and in somewhat it's really simple. That when we're looking at domestic abuse, particularly if we're looking at domestic abuse in children, it's the behaviors of the parent using violence, coercive control, abuse. It's their behaviors that are the source of the harm to the children. So that, and we'll talk about how those patterns of behavior are impacting child, partner, and family functioning. So it's very behavioral. So going back again to the alignment with this podcast, the model is extremely behavioral because the problem with domestic abuse is behaviorally defined. And a lot of people want to talk about narcissism or talk about personality disorders or talk about psychological symptoms or talk about addiction. And at the end of the day, domestic abuse is defined by these patterns of behavior because human beings struggle with control issues. Struggling with control isn't by itself make you abusive. You're trying to sort out what's mine, what's yours, what I have control over is to me a deeply spiritual, like Ruth said, a very human challenge. Raising your voice doesn't make you abusive automatically. It's about scope. It's about severity. It's about the domains of the functioning of other people you impact. It doesn't need to involve physical violence, but maybe you take all the doors off every room in the house, including the bathroom, because you don't like the way other people in the household close or don't close the doors, right? And just in that act, which many people wouldn't deem as violent, you see the invasive nature, you see the control, you see the privilege. I have the right to take away your privacy because I've deemed that you haven't used the door appropriately, or I don't want you to have that. So parents can get upset about kids not closing a cabinet door. That doesn't mean you're abusive or you're controlling. It's about behavior and it's about impact and about functioning. So the model is really very simple in saying you want to look for these patterns of behavior. You want to look at it holistically through a coercive control lens, include actions that harm the kids, not just siloing the kids from this, and then look at the impact on functioning. Now, when you do that, what's really important is that when you talk about male perpetrators, which is the majority but not the exclusive group, you all of a sudden raise up their responsibility as fathers because now you're starting to see the connection between those behaviors and kids having trouble in school. Now you're seeing them between missing doctor's appointments and those behaviors. So you're starting to see all these connections. And if you do this right, all of a sudden that statement, mom didn't get them to the doctor, or mom isn't able to maintain stable housing, it kind of drains away because you have the language to now say, oh, it's dad's violence and abuse and control that forced the kids to move 6 times in the last 5 years. And with those moves came academic instability, medical instability, forced mom out of jobs. You can see that picture, and we talk about multiple pathways to harm. So the model has all these elements to it that kind of reinforce each other to tell this very simple story. And in many cases, it's really father's choices and behaviors matter to family functioning, good or bad. And when it comes to domestic abuse, it's usually bad. And that's all we're doing is we're just kind of trying to reflect accurately the lived experience of these families. And what survivors tell us is important to them, how they're impacted, and what they'd like to see changed, adult and child survivors.
Did you want to add anything to that, Ruth?
No, I think that's pretty complete. I'm as a survivor, there's so much about the way that we use language and we frame the problems that really don't work for the dignity and well-being and welfare of children, adult and child survivors. It's just I feel like the one thing I would want to add is just a sense of curiosity, a desire, a curiosity, and also you know, uh, a willingness to talk about really hard realities about how we're not hitting the mark in that regard for survivors. Um, I'd really just want to send out a call to professionals to be a little bit brave and fearless in examining the realities that victim survivors are living in between all of these different services and systems and therapeutic models. And there's a lot of different therapeutic models that are being used, that are really just being used to blame survivors, even if they sound good on the outside. It's as if everybody's internal stance is really locked into position about assessing and litigating the survivor's responses to trauma, and rather than really pivoting to the cause, to the people who are causing the problem, and assessing and reviewing them for whether or not they can change, whether they're willing to change, whether they have the capacity, the desire, and the willingness to step into the space of adopting different behaviors for them to support and be connected to their children in ways that are beneficial to their children. And I really feel like it takes a little bit of bravery to do that. I think the one thing that I've noticed about professional responses, be it in the mental health community or be it in law enforcement or child protection or domestic violence services, is that there's a really defensive, reflexive reaction. And one of the things the model does well is that it helps to create an understanding that everybody is struggling with that same issue across the board, that practitioners don't really need to feel shame, maybe even about choices that they've made, that they now have been illuminated about the dangers and harms of, and the victim blamingness of. And we give them the tools to help them to do it differently in the language. And I think that's the big thing is that if we're asking people to do things differently, we actually have to give them the guidance and the words and the behaviors and the ways to do it. We can't just say do it differently. That's not how this works. So I think really my thing is very tangible. We've got to be brave. We've got to know we all live in this soup of victim blaming and victim focus. And we've got to be more willing to really review our actions collectively, our services, our offerings collectively, and how they're working for victim survivors and families, and help. And if they're working to help perpetrators do better, like adopt new behaviors, be a better father, be a better parent. I said I had nothing to add, and then I added a lot.
If if you watch
Well,
if you watch things, whenever people have nothing to add, they always say something great afterwards. So
well, and I just want to just, off of what Ruth's saying, just say, share something that's very concrete. Ruth was a primary author of something called our Ally Guide a few years ago, which then kind of found its way into a number of different other kind of products we've offered, and work we've done on coercive control and other things. And I think one of the things that strikes me, about Ruth, we're talking about services, and is that the model really tries to break down what's a very siloed service system. Well, I work with victims over here and I work with perpetrators over there. The shift to this perpetrator pattern-based approach changes the way you work with survivors. So her Ally Guide was really about how do you talk to, if you're kin, if you're family and friends, how do you listen to and listen for coded disclosures, or you talk to a family member, a loved one who might be a survivor or is a survivor, but in a non-blaming way. And so critical for having a non-blaming approach, and this is for professionals and for non-professionals, is you need to have a mental map that they're not responsible. That victim is not responsible for what somebody else is doing to them, even if they've got a trauma history, even if they've got their own addiction history, even if they've got their own mental health issues. Even if they're not always the best person, which is true for all of us, that they didn't deserve to be treated that way, but to have the language of responsibility. It's one of the first steps of partnering that we teach, which is we want to affirm that you're not responsible for your partner's choices and their behaviors, which is critical in all instances, but takes on a whole other level of meaning when you're talking to women who are mothers, because culture has taught them that it's their responsibility, that kids, what's happening to the kids in this household are their culture, religion, custom, psychology, even it's lessons about attachment theory. If you want to dive into sort of the mental health field, the message is you're responsible. And all this research around domestic abuse and the tie between mother's mental health and kids' mental health, right? And victims, adult and child victims. Well, a lot of that research is deeply flawed because it doesn't account for the fact they both share the same perpetrator. They posit that it's the mother's mental health that impacts the child's mental health. So this very simple fact that we have to talk to survivors and about survivors with this perpetrator pattern-based approach in mind, which is what we teach professionals, is embedded in this ally guide or is embedded in the other work. So we're really trying to break down these silos. So it isn't just the domestic violence advocate that's supposed to talk about the mom's strengths. It's the mental health person. It's the addiction person. It's this de-siloing, I think, that we're still trying to mine the value of, because if you're a mental health professional working with a survivor, and I'm going to channel Ruth right now, I want you to think about how you write about her parenting strengths in your reports. I want you to think about whether you just talk about her diagnosis and your treatment plan. I want you to think about whether you describe the perpetrator's behaviors and how they've created her anxiety, or is the perpetrator invisible in your note taking and reports? And I think this is not about you as an individual practitioner, but it's about systems and educational systems and training systems and documentation systems, or frameworks where people start their case presentations with, I've got a mom who's got a history of trauma, who's been in 3 abusive relationships. Her trauma has affected her relationship skills. She's making poor choices. And I want to support her in making better choices. And I really want people to hear that the intent is good. Because that statement is, I want her to be safe. I want her a better life. And I think in the book, I talk about the myth of trauma-informed practice, that well-intentioned approach may not always produce the results we hope it does, because what somebody may hear is, you're broken. I'm not talking about the person who harmed you. You've got to fix yourself. It's something you have control over. And if you're involved with these other systems like child protection or family court, I'm not going to point them to them as being the cause of the problem. I'm going to talk about your pathology, decontextualize it, and hand them, and maybe the perpetrator, an inadvertent weapon, which is now what's documented is mom's got PTSD, mom's got anxiety, and nobody's pointing at the perpetrator's parenting. So that's a lot, but it's, this is the Ally Guide. The book, is all part of the same kind of framework, which is really to shift the entire paradigm around how we work with families in this space.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. One of the things that stood out as you were talking, one of the things that we look at on this channel is that we've been indoctrinated with this, what I'd call like mentalistic psychology, which is this idea that our behavior is caused by some kind of internal mechanism, and that if we want to change the behavior, we have to change the internal mechanism. And what that tends to do is eliminate context, eliminate the interrelations between people. And so then behavior is made sense of as, well, you've got a mental health issue and that's why you're overwhelmed. Or you had trauma as a kid and that's why you're you deploying coercive control. Whereas what I love, and my next two questions are about coercive control and pattern-based assessment. So David, you're just like teeing me up here. What I love in your work and the work of people like Emma Katz and Evan Stark, who've really like pioneered work in this area, is the kind of I'd call it like contextual interactionist nature of it. So we're looking at why do people why does people's behavior make sense in that context, given what's going on and given what they're getting out of it. And that makes sense for, I think, for people using control and people trying to survive it, is if you look at what their choices are and what that allows them to do or maybe protects them from at times, then the behavior
Right.
kind of makes sense. So I'm wondering if we could jump to coercive control, because I love the use of that term, because I think some other terms around that have the word violence in them, people tend to jump straight to physical violence in particular and thinking that that's what it means. Whereas coercive control gives us I think, a much broader lens on what's going on. So I'm wondering if we could define what coercive control means and why it's an important concept for people to know about.
I think it's really important, to talk about this because it is being used more, and it is showing up in criminal law changes in Australia, and it is relevant to family law. Um, and it is most importantly such a powerful framework for understanding. And I'll share my thoughts about it, and then I'm sure Ruth will have some as well. But I think for me, since I've been doing this work, the heart of doing good, whether you call it family violence work or domestic abuse work or coercive control work, even the heart of it is this word control, and which is in my mind, I used to think about this as trying to a couple of different ways when I started my work, try to change how somebody else thinks, feels, or acts. Another way to think about it is that people who are doing this systematically are attacking somebody else's safety, self-determination, and satisfaction, right? So I want you to think about how focusing on those end results is so different than focusing on the act of violence and its absence or presence, because what you're talking about is the result of entrapment, the result of loss of liberty in choice, loss of freedom. So now we're moving into a human rights violation. It really gives us a different language and lens and makes us first centered on the experience of the survivor or victim, which is something's being taken away from them, something is being removed, choice is being removed, freedom is being removed, freedom to associate, freedom to live their spiritual beliefs, their cultural experiences, freedom to associate with their kids, freedom to pursue education. We now are more in alignment with the United Nations kind of framework of rights of people, which I think is also important. But it really it changes everything, because you don't ask if there was an arrest or an incident of violence. You ask for behaviors that might have created uh, entrapment, loss of liberty. It makes the distinction between I don't like what she's doing or I don't like what my partner's doing to, well, what did they do to stop you? I mean, it's very practical. Like, can you describe, and I would go even further, just so you know, when I did work with men primarily use violence and abuse and control, is I would ask them, I wouldn't even ask them intent sometimes. I'd say, describe to me what you did. And even in my professional work now, a lot of people say, well, he controls her. And I'll say, describe to me what he does to control her. Well, he stops her from going to work. And then I'll say to them, describe to me how he stops her from going to work. And it's in that moment of answering that question, how do you stop her from going to work? Or how does he stop her from going to work? That it's almost like taking a lens that's fuzzy and like it all becomes super clearer if that information is available, or the lack of clarity becomes clear if that makes sense. Which is sort of like, oh, you don't know, so but as soon as you say, oh, he takes the the alternator out of the car so she can't leave. Now, leaving her stranded in a rural area with two young kids. Or he stops her from working by showing up at her workplace or calling her 50 times during the day. Like there's nothing left to the imagination at that point. You can easily put yourself in the experience of that victim and say, "Oh my God, that's to try to navigate your boss who's telling you to work, and then you're being told you're going to get written up if you get another phone call, knowing you don't have a choice to take the phone call because you'll get in trouble and he'll get violent at home. It becomes really easy to align yourself with that lived experience, or easier than when you just say, well, he's abusive to her, he's controlling even. So for me, that behavioral lens, is so combined with the coercive control concept is so critical. So I don't, Ruth, I'm sure you've
Boy.
got stuff to add. You've got,
Oh
I'm sure.
boy, howdy do I. Okay, so mental mechanics theories. I mean, let's just start there. You know, is a science that is not criminology, right? And we are talking about legal proceedings, incarceration, and the removal of custody of children from parents, which is a rights issue, right? So I think one of the things that we need to kind of pull apart is how psychology and psychological theories of how the mind works, which are not set in stone, and are still evolving greatly based off of our expanding awareness and understanding of neurobiology in the brain, right? And behavioral cognitive therapies, are not how we establish somebody's culpability. And that should just be an understanding that we all operate from. That as, therapists or psychologists, they can speculate about what are the mechanics in the brain that, or the traumas that led to a person engaging in a certain pattern of behaviors that was criminal and harmful, right? But what we really need to do is we should be assessing those people for their ability to recognize that they've committed harm, for their ability to change their behaviors, right? Isn't that the direction that we should all be headed in if we're talking about therapeutic models? What is therapeutic about ignoring behaviors and living in the world of theory about why those behaviors happened, even if we gain some really good science about behavioral realities? And in the world of rights, custody, access, liberties, incarceration, this should be a big, big red flag no, that unless we're talking about tangible behaviors that somebody actually committed, that we can show, that we can document, and we can show the direct harm of those behaviors, that it doesn't matter somebody's diagnosis, somebody's medical mental diagnosis, their sickness, their pathology. What matters is if they can engage themselves in meaningful change around their behaviors. Right. That's it. That's what matters. Yeah. And so all of these professionals out there teaching these workshops, theorizing about why perpetrators are the way they are. Oh my gosh. Okay, guys, let's land in some concrete, tangible things that actually align with your professional credentials, your mandate, and your professional ethics. And a lot of people are using psychological theory and adding it into case file notes as if it's real, as if they've diagnosed someone, even when a perpetrator claims that a person is crazy, even when a perpetrator says that a person has a mental health disorder or is addicted, that is being written down and put in case files, and that is becoming the basis of evidence that lawyers, judges, child protection workers are all using to remove people's rights. And all of us should just say, no, that's not okay. So I'm hot
Yeah,
around the ears about this issue.
good,
Let me
She's
tell
been
you.
good.
talking about this
Can I
she's been talking about this for a couple of days now,
can
specifically.
I
Cranky
This is
can I
survivor right
jump
there.
on that? Can I jump on that, Ruth? Because you are like on fire and I love it. And if we look at what the damage that psychology has done to the world, we look at race science, we look at eugenics, we look at like all the absolute bullshit that white men in lab coats have said, no, no, this is true, this is how the world works because I measured someone's skull and correlated it with something, then we should be very, very skeptical of it. And any system that starts with a theory and then tries to prove it rather than observing events and then building a theory based on observation, I am not, I'm
right.
just not having it.
And I think that, to fill in a couple of additional points. One is if I've got limited time with somebody, Ruth's point, and I think I'm trained in mental health. I'm trained in psychology, right? So I'm speaking about my own sector and field and training, so, and is that, that kind of, uh, let's go back to where this quote unquote came from. Let's go back to your childhood. Let's explore your feelings. Every minute we do that, we're not asking another question about what did you do? How did you do that? How did it impact the other person? What does that mean to you that they were scared of you? Right? These are the things that Ruth was talking about. These are the practical things. And it really is a matter of time and energy, right? And focus. Now, now how much they can absorb, how they understand their behavior, how much they're willing to engage and change. That may have a lot of factors, including their childhood, that may be influencing that. I grant that. But if we don't do that, we don't keep our focus on the here and now, the behavioral, the assessment of can this person accept responsibility? Do they say they want to change? I mean, we do this in addiction work all the time. Does somebody admit they have a problem? It's very tangible, right? And if I can't admit I have a problem, then the consensus is, well, I'm likely to drink again or use drugs again. It's higher. That doesn't guarantee anything one way or the other. But similarly in this space, you'd be looking for somebody to admit that they've got a problem with their behavior, acknowledge, be able to show that they harmed other people, and then look at what kind of plan can be put in place for them to change their behavior. And I think the other area, and you started, Ollie, with the survivors and sort of working with survivors, but there's really very aligned work with what we're doing, response based therapy. Alan Wade and his work has influenced a lot of the child protection work in New South Wales. And I remember listening to him once, and I know it was brilliant. He's got a very strong, if you don't know him, he's got a very strong critique of the American therapy, psychology, pharmaceutical, insurance industry, and so it very much probably aligns, Ollie, with some of the things that you think and you'd believe in. But he said something really, he was really great, it really kind of brought home for me this idea of we can spend too much time focusing on people's inner worlds. And that sounds horrible because I'm a big believer in the importance of inner worlds, my inner world, and, the people that I love's inner world. But he said, we're often, when somebody experiences a trauma, we ask, or they're attacked, we often ask, well, how'd that feel? Or what was that like? Right? Almost like we're news interviewers. What was that like? We think that somehow, but what he said is if we want to be in a kind of a strength-based mode, in a really understanding what resistance looks like, because human beings resist violence. That's natural. We resist violence. We resist control. We strategize. We may not look like we're resisting, just like animals go limp to protect themselves, right? That people think, oh, they're not fighting back. Well, they're doing something to protect themselves, though. Because if playing dead means that you're not going to get attacked, playing dead is a good strategy. So what he found is that if you ask survivors, and he did this across not just family violence, but like colonizations, different things, When that was done to you, what did you do next? In a non-judgmental way, in a non-blaming way, not like, well, what did you do? But instead of describe to me your response in a really kind of inviting, non-judgmental, I'm curious way, you'd hear amazing things that people did and thought in the context of abuse that just makes you go, oh my God, you're actively strategizing. And I know this from my work. You would hear stories about survivors actively strategizing for the safety of their children while they're being assaulted. And if we just say, well, let's talk about your trauma. Yes, that may have produced that assault, may have produced anxiety. Like I don't want to be like painted as not caring, but that person who also has anxiety about going into that room or a discussion about money or fear in the future, they also may have 6 different strategies and active things they're doing to keep their kids from being exposed. And they need to be seen in that and validated in that. So this is again another kind of caution around when we spend time saying, well, how'd that feel? Or what was the symptoms? Or we don't explore that. What did you do? How did you respond? What was the next thing you did? What was even your thinking? Not even what were you feeling, but what were you thinking? What was your planning? To me, we do that in our partnering work. We do that but I can guarantee that line of questioning, if you don't do it and you don't use it in your work and you work with survivors, will open up a tremendously different set of information, unlock a different experience for that person, and maybe radically change your work with them forever.
Good plug for that style. I love it. Thanks, David. I think one thing I was thinking as you were talking was obviously we're not saying history is not an important factor in how we behave now. We're just saying history, or I'm saying history, there's no evidence that history creates some kind of internal mechanism that then makes me do things in the future. I think lay people know that, if you're in a car accident and then the next time you get in the car, you feel panicky, even though nothing's happening, people understand that. People go, yep, that's associated with what happened before. And I think with survivors, and you're saying also with perpetrators, that these behaviors have a history and they have um, meanings that come from the past. And if we can unpack and understand those as they show up in the present, it can be useful.
Yeah. And what I
Yeah.
just want to say, just meaning the past, I mean, again, I think, again, again, I feel like I'm knocking my people, but this sort of relentless push to kind of go back to childhood
Hmm.
misses so many things. Like two guys I worked with back to back who were abusive. One was really changing, the other wasn't. Now, maybe there's a bunch of factors, but what I also was aware of, one of them had a good buddy who actually physically stopped him from being abusive. Another had a brother who egged him on. When we kind of go back to, well, tell me about your mother. I mean, being really stereotypical. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. What did you grow up with? I'm not saying those things aren't relevant. And, we may be missing, that there's a guy sitting next to you on the bar stool who's your brother, who's telling you in your ear, how can you live with that? How can you let her treat you that way? That's not history. That's right now.
I think
Hmm.
one of the problems I have with that sort of historical trauma lens is that it really plays into justifying a lack of self-control. Everybody has trauma. That's a common human experience. In fact, it's one of the most common human experiences that we have trauma. We share that together, right? That doesn't mean that we are going to become dysfunctional, criminal, violent, incapable of social interaction that is boundaried, right? And if somebody has so much trauma from their childhood that in the present moment, They are violent, incapable of controlling their behavior, unboundaried. They are the problem at that moment, right? We can work with them therapeutically to try to disrupt that trauma related behavioral conditioning. And a lot of what people are not talking about, I think, too, when we say that a lot of these people have historical trauma, is they're not naming who handed that trauma to that child via very intentional, systematic, over time behavioral conditioning. And that was most likely a perpetrator who was a parent, or a perpetrator who is a parent figure, a perpetrator who is an authority figure. Um, and that, yes, that if we know that that's the case, if we all agree that childhood trauma can condition people into behavioral ways of relating that are detrimental to our connection, our sustained healthy connection, then we need to all sit down and have a conversation about how we deal with that in the present moment, both with accountability, therapeutically, while not giving any play to the idea that there's justifiable behaviors of violence that other people have to uh, take, that they have to sustain, and that really we all collectively, if there's somebody that is so harmed by trauma, who is so mentally unwell and incapable of behavioral modification and modulation, they should not have access to children, right? We should assess that really carefully. We should really understand their ability to parent. I don't know how this got so convoluted in a way. It's kind of like wondering where the adults are in the room. I do know like the historical reasons. I understand our human propensity, and I don't actually believe our systems were made to really address and focus on the people who were causing the problem. I think it was meant to do other things. But right now, in this point in time, I think that we can all agree that even if somebody has a tremendous amount of historical trauma and we feel deeply empathetic for them and we want them to get better and we want to help them, that if they cannot control their behaviors, that we have to take some intervening actions. We must, especially when children are involved or people who are innocent, who do not need to care for that person or sustain them to the detriment of their well-being and safety. We don't need to do that. Even if somebody has a mental illness that's diagnosed and we feel terrible for them, as a society, we need to agree how we're going to support and sustain that person in a safe way that respects their dignity given their condition, but do not demand that people sustain that violence. Do not demand that. It's not okay.
Mm. Yeah, and I think if we broaden our, because I think it gets narrowly confined to thinking about history as trauma history, and if we just think about history of how behavior has worked out for people, then people who use control, their behavior probably does make sense because in the past it has worked for them in different contexts. What I kind of say to survivors who are questioning whether the person using control is you know, being driven by some internal demons is, as you all have said, is, well, if that were the case, wouldn't you expect that to be presenting in other contexts in their life? Like if you just can't handle someone saying no to you, then what happens at the supermarket or the post office or the bank? But
Right.
if someone's behavior is contained to a particular context, then I think we need to really look at it in that context and say what is the function of that behavior in that place.
I think that just that example, Ali, you talking about, to extend the conversation about behavior, and to I guess for me to think about, to saying to that person, to really hear their question and say, be curious what's important to you about whether that's true or not. To ask that and to listen to their answer. Why are they curious about that? Why are they asking you, a professional, is his behavior? Because the question, the answer means something to them. And oftentimes it's, well, does it make me feel more compassionate to them? And without even knowing what their answer is, one of the questions you could have as a follow-up is, does that change any of the things about how you feel about how he's treated you, or how much his behavior has hurt you, or how scared you are? Like it for me, I've tried to keep this the very kind of almost really simple level. Sometimes I tell people I'm not a very smart person. I just want to have a very simple conversation with you. I want a very simple conversation about what's important. I want to stay focused on the simplest aspect of this. Um, uh, Going back to the healing, for instance, and the trauma. When somebody'd say to me, he has to heal his trauma first before he stops being violent. To me, I stop and think and go, like Ruth said, so his partner has to wait until he's healed his trauma. And then I kind of ask myself, well, if we know healing's a journey, not a destination, when does that happen exactly? At 6 o'clock in the afternoon and 9 o'clock at night? You know what I mean? It's just, for me, sometimes I want to just think about this and be curious about, what do you mean when you say that? And so when a survivor says, is curious about, because I'd get survivors saying to me in group, is he getting better? They'd want to know if I thought he was getting better, right? I was sitting with him in group, and I often wouldn't answer. I'd say, well, what's really important is your experience of him, and is he different with you? What I think is the professional is not super relevant. I want to know if so this is just me keeping the goal at the center, which is, if this intervention with him is working, you should feel safer. If this intervention with him is working, he should be coming home and saying he was wrong. I really want to keep it out of the magical and mystical sort of psychological theory world, his inner child and his healing his narcissism. And, it really should be measurable and tangible and visible to all of us, particularly her, which is he different with you? And do you feel different? And often the answer was, well, he comes home from group and he blames me. And he says it's all my fault that I have to go to group. And I go, okay, so for me, what you're telling me is he's not treating you any differently. They go, no, he isn't. Or sometimes they'll say, well, he's not hitting me anymore, but he's controlling everything I do because he stopped drinking. But now he's criticizing my parenting. He's controlling the money. I don't feel any freer. In fact, I feel more controlled. When he was drunk and sleeping on the couch, at least I had 6 hours where I knew he wasn't going to bother me. So I was always very curious in the kind of lived experience. I think there's something really just about, are we really listening to survivors? Are we putting our psychological theories on them about how we think change looks like? And I could go on about this motivational interviewing and, the theory of motivational interviewing with survivors, and how it postulates that the end goal is leaving. When motivational interviewing has been applied to survivors, when you really listen to people applying that psychological theory, they're like, well, where is she on the journey to leaving the relationship? So they've decided, regardless of culture, regardless of kids, regardless of finances, regardless of danger, she's supposed to be on a journey to leaving the relationship. And to me, that's not paying attention to her. That's judging her by your theory and what you think her journey should be. I think we need to listen more. I think we need to really kind of prioritize, well, what's important to you? What does his fight with his demons mean to you? And I would always tell people, her love for him isn't a problem. Because there's nothing her love does to cause his violence. Her love doesn't mean she won't leave or she won't set a boundary. But we make a lot of professionals make a lot out of survivors saying, I still love him. And this goes back, I think, maybe kind of, Ruth, to a few of your earlier points, right? About this sort of labeling of people and this inner world, which is sort of like, wait a second, love isn't behavior, love isn't choice, love isn't caring for him, even though he's harmed her, is not a crime. But we often treat her as the broken one, something wrong with her when she says, I still love him. There's something wrong with that. There's something really wrong with that when we do that.
Well, I think the reason that we do that is because we want to force an action, a severing action, because we believe that that is the pathway to safety. And a lot of times when professionals do things that are really harmful, it's because they've drawn a conclusion about how this should all go. And they're trying to force that conclusion on a victim survivor, even if it is not to in their best interest, even if it could cause them more danger. And even if it usurps their autonomy and rights. And one of the things that I really hold as sacred is that we are all on this journey of learning in life. And there is a sort of mystery about our individual journeys where it doesn't seem fair, does it? There's a lot of unfairness in the world. And life isn't fair and it's not unfair either. It simply is. It is what it is. And we have to double down on respecting and honoring people's autonomy, even when we question their decision making. And the way to do that as a professional is to really get curious and to really stay in that place and go through the information in a very mindful and present way about what the challenges of that survivor are. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there will be cases, there will be people that will absolutely rip your heart out where you wish that they would make a different choice. And we've seen it over and over again, where even if children were removed from a woman who is in connection in a relationship, even if it was coerced with a person who is violent, she has said, yes, I understand. Take the children and bring them to a place where they're safe, but I cannot abandon this person. And there is a deep mystery in that. And that is absolutely the right of that person to make that choice, even if it's not in their best interest. And this is where I think I diverge from a lot of psychological models as well that really say that we can suspend people's rights for their best interest to keep them alive, to keep them from suiciding themselves or doing this or doing that. And I say, actually, we don't have that right. We don't. We can only work with people and control people so far. And after a point, we do harm to ourselves, to society, to our commitment and dedication to human rights and freedom. If we can't also stop and say, I am not your savior. I'm here on a journey with you, and you have to make some tough decisions. And I'm gonna respect your dignity, your rights, your autonomy, and I'm going to try to support you the best way I can. And I think that's hard for people who really feel like they're out there to save people. And I do think that we need to avoid that mentality.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, David. We've like the conversation's just flowing nicely, but I know you guys have. Well, I know Ruth's got to get to bed, and David will just keep on going. But I just wanted to probably. I've got a ton more questions, but I think the most important is I'd love to hear both talk about the difference between a pattern-based and an incident-based assessment, because I think that's one of the most important things for people to get their heads around. And like why you think that shift to a pattern-based assessment is really important if we're working with people.
I mean, I'm going to just be simple about it. Pattern-based assessment is the only way you can really understand what's going on. So if you do an incident-based assessment, you're usually talking about physical violence, and you're looking for incidents of physical violence. And often we know that that's maybe the least common form of abuse. That there are many other emotional abuse is more common, psychological abuse, financial abuse, and that the entrapment, you only can find coercive control if you're looking for patterns of behavior. Now, if you go looking, you use the lens of coercive control and a pattern-based approach. And a pattern-based approach, by the way, that really doesn't silo. This is a historical mistake. Silo adult to adult behavior from adult to child behavior. That one of the things the model does is say this person is often going to be perpetrating against the adult survivor and the kids and controlling the whole household environment. And so we include actions taken to harm the kids, undermine the other person's parenting, physically, emotionally, sexually abusing the kids, neglecting the kids, using the kids as a weapon. So we have a very holistic view. And in fact, the pattern-based approach to the model may include behaviors to past partners and to other children, behaviors to strangers, to systems, professionals, law enforcement. It includes understanding how status impacts it. If I'm a law enforcement officer, I don't need to hit you to control you. If I'm a bouncer at a bar, if I'm six, so once we start getting past the physical violence incident approach and put this in a pattern-based lens of coercive control, you see more, you understand more, you're more in alignment with the lived experience of other people because the guy who I worked with said, well, I didn't need to beat up my wife because she saw me bounce people at the bar and she knew I was a black belt, right? He's being honest. I didn't need to hit her to scare her. I didn't need to hit her to control her. So you have to look for that pattern-based connection between these behaviors and its impact. If you go looking for that, doesn't mean you're going to find it. It may mean you're really good at saying, wow, this is limited. This is situational. Or you may find, wow, this is much worse than an arrest for misdemeanor shows, because once we string together all this together, this person looks scarier. And so a pattern-based approach keeps us focused on the person using violence, not the relationship, because the pattern belongs to them. So there's a lot of things that when you shift into a pattern-based lens that kind of comes with it, as at least we define it. So I think it's really almost comparing apples and oranges, really, in terms of how you approach the conversation about domestic and family violence.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the behavioral focus is the key. To me, it's extremely tangible. It's very concrete. You can assess it, you can adjudicate it, you can litigate it, you can gather the evidence. And this is where I think about our children when they were like 2 or 3, right? Very defiant that age, the terrible threes, I call it. And you had to scaffold your behavioral modification and you had to really work at it in a systematic way to try to help that out of control, dysregulated, emotionally melting down child in a really consistent manner. And I think anybody who's probably ever parented a 2 or 3 year old or a 14, 13, 14, or 15-year-old can attest to that level of staying present and working with the pattern because it is a pattern. And so I just feel like it's the most logical way to approach assessing a person's actual behavioral presence in the world and in their family. It's the most honest way to do so. And we all need to remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to focus on the person who's causing the harm, to assess and intervene and address and hold accountable, hopefully, their behaviors. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the hope is that they can, with that scaffolded help, that scaffolded attention and assistance and therapeutic, consistency, that they can change their behaviors to have behaviors which support their healthy, sustainable, nurturing connection with themselves, their children, and their potential partners. That's really the hope, and I hope that we could all get behind those type of actions, investing in them, understanding the value of them, right? And I really feel that people who don't understand the importance of investing in actions which lead us to a place of assessment and intervention and giving people the opportunities and skills and behaviors, and support to change, that we're not doing our jobs well, that we're actually objectifying people who are in pain, who have been taught horrible behaviors, relational behavioral patterns, that have had those behavioral patterns supported by non-action, by everybody ignoring the problem, by people feeling uncomfortable and not naming it, by people hypothesizing about why it was happening rather than directly addressing the behaviors and working with that person. And I feel like that's a real injustice to people who are struggling with trauma, and a real injustice to people who potentially could learn how to do it better if we gave them the opportunities and we worked with them to do so.
Well, thank you both. I think that's a great place to pause the conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for the model. I'm going to put a link to David's book in the description. I'm going to put a link to your Partnered with a Survivor podcast and to the Institute website. And I might also just put a link to the work of Emma Katz and Evan Stark, because I think for people who are interested in digging deeper, particularly Emma's recent book, Coercive Control, is I think a must read several times. Um, is there anything else that you want to shout out? Any other work you want to draw people's attention to before we finish up?
I don't
I
think
do.
so.
Go ahead, Ruth.
The one thing that I would want to say is that I always send my regards and my admiration to Australia, actually, for the holistic work that they're doing. And because we work globally, we really see the real effort that's going into investing in more holistic practice. So just really grateful you had us on, Ollie. Thank you.
And all I was going to want to say is, given the focus of the podcast, give an additional shout out to the book. The book is organized around challenging a bunch of these practice myths that have arisen that may have been useful at some point, but really they're often canonical for like practitioners, or like they're things they believe in, like the child witness to violence, or the domestic violence incident, the cycle of violence. I didn't get to say this earlier, sort of just really, if you're interested in these things and really kind of being challenged to think a little bit differently, to unpack your professional ideas, and to be validated as a survivor if you're a survivor, because that's what we're hearing. The book really is designed to do that. It's a little bit different than some of the other books, because it's really meant to sort of be a little bit iconoclastic and say, maybe this thing you thought and took for granted, maybe it isn't as helpful for you in your practice as you thought it was. Maybe there's a better way to approach that same question and achieve, the results you wanted. So just a little bit of plug for the book.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, there's it's like you've got several chapters devoted to debunking the kind of cultural folklore that we're all kind of raised in. And of course, we start from that point, but we don't want to stay at that point. if we want to do our best work, we need to be reflecting on that and kind of critiquing our own belief systems. And to do that, you gotta pull it to the surface and see that it is a belief system and not the truth of the world. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it was a really rich conversation. I appreciate both of you, jumping on at night time, your time, and appreciate your work, the work you're doing. And yeah, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Ollie.